My name is Josh Angelchik. I'm a senior data scientist at Ironside Group. I'm joined by my colleague, Lucinda Linde. She's going to be our de facto subject matter expert for the day. Just do want to call out before we get into the thick of things that the Q&A chat should definitely be utilized. So as questions come up, feel free to drop things in there, and we'll try to get those answered either in real time as the presentation's going along or during the Q&A allotted time we've got at the end. Without further ado, I'll hand it off to Lucinda Linde. Before, I just want to quickly plug our next upcoming series will take place on August 24th, and that's going to be with respect to some IBM security practices. So please keep your eyes peeled for that. We do have a poll that I want to take before everyone gets too settled. And what we want to really call out here is, how familiar are you with generative AI? And what do you perceive as the value? Do you think it's all hype? Is there already applications that you've discovered for yourself that are really worthwhile? And I think if you're not terribly familiar, the next sort of subject matter that Lucinda is going to get into should be really helpful, kind of giving you a peek into what's happening underneath the hood and what are we hearing on the street in terms of potential use cases or questions that executives are having with respect to generative AI.
Okay, so you're going to talk about the poll, or should I go ahead?
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay.
Just to, I guess, give people a feel for what we're seeing in the poll. A lot of people are here to either gain an understanding or they already have generative AI projects underway. Most folks are curious while some are confident. Not too many people have said they're identifying a use case, so perhaps that's a bridge we can help gap here during our session.
All right. Super.
And with that, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. That's fantastic context. Thank you very much, Josh. And so, yeah, let's talk about questions that people in enterprises might be asking about generative AI. And they kind of fall into two buckets. One is, what are we dealing with here? And the second bucket is really, okay, if I'm interested, how do I proceed? So just kind of briefly touching on this, and we will try to hit most of these questions today. What is generative AI, and what are the potential benefits that it might bring to your business? Is the rise of generative AI a passing trend? Is it a flash in the pan? Or is it fundamentally changing the business landscape? Then in terms of business, which industries are being impacted? Which functions in your organization are being impacted? How long will it take? How can generative AI impact your business model, or even what products you're offering? And what are your competitors doing with generative AI? What kind of ROI are people seeing? I'm going to give you the answer to that one right now. It's hard to tell. It's early days, and most people aren't bragging about what they're seeing. So that's just one of the issues. But we do know where people are putting their dollars for investment. Use cases. What are the use cases that can be used with generative AI, and how are those likely to evolve over time? What are some new opportunities and challenges of this fundamentally new capability? And then if you're piloting, do you want to get out in front? Is it better to wait till things settle out? The risks and benefits of those two options. And if you want to get started, what are some low-risk ways to experiment and learn about it? There are also downsides to generative AI. There are some legal and business risks that ought to be considered when incorporating generative AI, both as a tool and as a collaborator. And what is the impact of automating tasks that with limited human feedback? Finally, really, the question is like, how do you leverage? How can a company leverage its internal data to use that as a competitive advantage? If everybody uses the same generative AI, then there is really essentially a level playing field. But if you're applying your own data to it and creating competitive advantage, that's an activity that might actually yield some good business outcomes. Okay, so let's start with the first couple of questions. What is generative AI and why is it important? So generative AI can create new and original content, whether that content is text or audio or images or even proteins. There are kind of protein sequence based generative AIs or genetic based. So I think that's very important. The way that a generative AI gets trained is that you start with a massive amount of text data. Let's say just for large language models is text. And you're looking at all the content of the internet, all of Wikipedia, all of Stack Overflow, which is a coding resource that people use for software coding. And you bring those in and you have the model just go over and get trained on this this massive text corpus is what it's called. Once you have a trained model, which means all the settings are set, then you can take, so that's the blue is the training, the green is the prompting. So you put in a prompt and you're asking for something like, hey, give me best practices in designing an onboarding process for my organization. You put that in there, you use the trained transformer, it's kind of mapping the query to the information that it has, and then it's formulating a text-based response. So that's kind of how it works right now. And it's also having a dramatic impact. If you can ask questions like that and do things faster than you could before, there's, I think, ability to have a profound impact on knowledge workers. So let's first of all talk about what's all this jargon. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, etc. Artificial intelligence is kind of like the big bucket. It's the concept that includes a lot of things that currently exist, as well as things that people would like to have exist. And so it can contain a lot of hype. Machine learning is where you actually is a subset of AI, where you ask algorithms to look at data, extract the patterns, kind of create settings. And this can be for structured data, like lots of tables, or it can be for languages, and just and use those settings as a means of making predictions. So it's not about writing rules and step-by-step rules. It's about letting the data tell you what the patterns are. Deep learning is a kind of subset of neural networks, but neural networks are a much more complex way meant to kind of mimic the brain for how you think about how you process data. Those are deep neural networks with lots of layers. Now here you're starting to get a little bit more opaque in terms of understanding what's going on inside of the artificial intelligence. And then finally, there's generative AI, which is a sub part of deep learning based on transformers, a novel architecture that Google first revealed in their paper, All You Need Is Attention, in 2017.
Lucinda, we do have some questions popping up in the chat that I think are pretty relevant for this slide.
Great.
So if we can just go back. So one is, what does generative AI do that traditional ML cannot? / how do I know if I should use generative AI versus machine learning?
Okay, great question. So generative AI is used for things like, the types of generative AIs that have been built have been like for language, where the element being used is words, and images, where the element being used is pixels. So it's really more like when you are using these incredibly rich, data sets in terms of all the words that are in there, or all the pixels that are in there, and all the images that those things can generate. Those are good candidates for generative AI, or like genetics sequences and proteins, etc. Machine learning is like in that larger category. There is really, I think, is for like structured data. So when you have tables and you have lines of features where you know what the data is, and there actually is a little bit of transparency into what's causing this machine learning to predict in a certain way. So so I would say if you have unstructured data, then it's more likely that you would want to use a deep learning network or a generative AI. And if you are using machine learning, structured data, then you can use that more here. These boundaries are being a little bit, blurred as generative AI. They're doing add-ons and other things to generative AI to help it process more structured data. But I think another thing is cost as well. Machine learning can be, has certain costs to implement. Generative AI probably uses more compute and has higher costs. So cost may be another reason of deciding between one or the other.
And would you say it's fair to summarize that as perhaps machine learning allows you to understand relationships of your data, whereas generative AI has a great niche of high output with little input?
Yes, I think you can, yeah, I think that's a good thing. If you look at how ChatGPT works, yeah, you can actually put pretty open-ended questions and get kind of decent answers to that. So I do think that's another distinction there as well. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, and then one last question, which actually segues perfectly into your next slides here. What are some real-world examples of efficiencies that generative AI can produce?
Thank you, whoever asked that question. So MIT put out a study in March of this year where they took 400 people and divided them into two groups, 200 who did not use ChatGPT and 200 who did use ChatGPT. That's the green one here called treatment. Those are the people who use ChatGPT. They then asked them to do tasks that would take about a half an hour if they weren't using ChatGPT. And they also had a wide variety of different tasks, like coding, writing essays, etc. And they had judging panels that judged each one of the responses in the various areas. And what they found was that, and this is really where you can see the impact on knowledge workers, is that people in the used ChatGPT, or the green here, they spent less time on brainstorming and drafting and more time on editing. So not only did the ChatGPT group create their responses in a third less time. ChatGPT took 17 minutes on average, non-ChatGPT took 27 minutes. They also gave higher quality answers, with the ChatGPT group scoring 4.5 out of 7 on quality scale, and the non-ChatGPT groups scoring 3.8. And this quality and time increase was across the board for both less skilled participants as well as more skilled. So ChatGPT really reduced the time required for brainstorming and drafting. It allowed allow people to do more time editing. So that's really how, some idea of like what it's doing for knowledge workers. So let's look at some specific tasks and what kind of improvement that you can see. So a colleague of mine, Paul Baier, he's founder of GAI Insights. He talked to a whole bunch of different people and asked them, well, before ChatGPT, how long would this task take? So in terms of writing use cases, test scripts, or code for API, it would take 40 hours for this person to write those things. It took 2 hours with ChatGPT. Writing 3 drafts of response to an angry email, a customer email or phone call, took 2 hours. And with ChatGPT, it's 2 minutes. It basically generates it, and then you just edit it, and you're off to the races. So these are very important. This is kind of like at a granular level on the task basis, how much you can actually improve. Another question is that people have is generative AI a passing trend, or is it transforming business? Listening to a Gartner seminar, they were talking about, their quote was, AI is not just the technology anymore, it's shaping business. It's impacting what it means to be human, and it's impacting society. So if you look at how big and how fast it's moving, look at this graph here. It took Twitter 2 years to get to 1 million users, and it took ChatGPT 5 days. There are now 170 million people who signed out for OpenAI. Those are the numbers as of April of this year. We don't have any more updated numbers than that. But so it's really big. You've got basically at least 170 million people experimenting with this, trying it out in pretty much every niche of personal and business endeavors. So some advice is, don't ignore it, start experimenting. Embrace it, but you also have to advance responsibly. We'll talk about some aspects of that. This is not going to stop. Don't get carried away by the hype, but also do not underestimate this. This is a seismic shift In a way, it's kind of like we're in 1996 of the internet. And while there was a big hype and crash at that, in the early 2000s, if you look at how society is now compared to 1994, there's a huge difference on the impact. So any
Someone's
other
asking in the
questions?
chat, sorry to interject here, but also relevant to the next slide, someone asked, what part of my business is best suited for generative AI?
All right. Thank you so much. So in fact, that's exactly what we're talking about. Impact on business and which use cases promise more value. So McKinsey put together a study on what will be the economic impact of generative AI. And they looked at a lot of different industries. So here on the left-hand side, you see high tech, banking, pharmaceuticals, et cetera. On the top, you see marketing, sales, customer operations, product, and R&D. You have here on this first column, what is the percent of industry revenue that will be impacted by generative AI? And here is the absolute dollar values, 240 to 260 billion. If you look at the red square here where they have the darker blues, you can see that a lot of the business a lot of the impact is in these 4 areas: marketing, sales, customer operations, software, product and R&D, and various types of software engineering. In fact, the study continues, 75% of business value will come across these 4 corporate areas. So some examples of this are for coders. Many coders are using GitHub Copilot or AWS Code Whisperer to basically, make their coding much more efficient. I mean, I'm finding this is huge. I love it. Digital marketers are using Jasper AI, which incorporates generative AI in the marketing workflow. Customer service, lots of people are using GAI-powered chatbots. Salespeople, there's a company called Viva Sales, and what that does is if you get an email that says, hey, can you send me a proposal on this, this, and this, it'll go into the customer records, write in the drop-down menu, just hit make proposal. It'll draft a proposal with all the customer information in it, and then you do your edit, you read it over, and you send it away. At the protein level, you can use BioNeMo to engineer your proteins. And financial report creators can use Bloomberg GPT, which is a specially purposed generative AI on financial data.
Someone's curious how you can make it safe for your employees to work with generative AI.
Yes.
I think that's covered a little bit later, but definitely
Yeah.
acknowledging the question because it's an important one.
Yeah, just briefly, but we'll talk about this in more detail. I don't think you're going to stop people from using generative AIs. You just want to put some capability in place where it's safe for them to use it within your company. So, but we'll explain that in more detail. So, any other questions at all, Josh, that you wanted to ask, or?
So people are asking, how can I choose which generative AI model is best for me?
Yeah.
I think we should probably dig into that one.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So that's great. So there are hundreds, it feels probably are hundreds of generative AI capabilities that are being built. Everything from special purpose like the Bloomberg GPT to the huge models that Google, Facebook, and OpenAI are putting out, as well as a lot of open source ones that are really pushing the envelope forward very quickly. So which ones do you use? Well, one way is to look at Stanford has something called HELM, which is Holistic Evaluation of Language Models. And that way you can see a lot of benchmarks and certain measures that they've put together in to rate these models against each other. Another one is size. If you have really large and complex data, there are certain large language models that are better. If you have certain use cases like translation, you may want to use Google Translate or Bard because those are extremely good at doing those. So there are pros and cons. Probably just go look through these through the Helm and look at, well, what is the exact use case and how does it apply? And then try out a few of them, because you can do a lot of research on things, but in some sense, you really don't know until you hook in the API and try out that model on what you're trying to do.
Someone else is asking, can I feed a model my data to make it better? So
absolutely,
that sounds to me like transfer learning.
Transfer learning. So yes, you can actually, there are a few different levels of ways you can work with a large language model. You can manually prompt engineer. In other words, say things like, you are an expert in HR processes, and please answer this question. So another way is to do something called RAG, which is Retrieval Augmented Generative AI. And that is to basically use the generative AI 2 times. One is go find all the subject matter on this, kind of find the structure of that subject matter, and then use that structure in a prompt. So it's kind of like 2 passes at the using language model twice. You can fine tune it, and this is where you're talking about, Josh, with transfer learning, where you can actually use your corporate data and use it to change the settings essentially in the overall model. And then you can also build your own language model like Bloomberg did, but that takes a lot of money. Great. So what I'm going to do is now talk about what do you do if you want to experiment and pilot with generative AI this year. So a couple of things. One is to set up the infrastructure to learn, and I'm going to just go over this briefly. But if people, we'll be able to give you a link to the presentation here, so you can read it more. You create a secure sandbox so that people, and I will talk about this more. You also have a multifunction guidance team to basically learn from implementing the generative AI, to be able to figure out how to connect it to the other parts of your process flow, like your customer experience process flow or your marketing process flow. You develop ground rules like do not put personal identifiable information or proprietary data into the generative AI until it's proven safe. Have an auditing process for whatever capability you're going to be using. If you're in a regulated industry, some of them are closing down access to generative AI. And then exceptions to the ban have to go through the guidance committee. So just briefly here, because I know we're going to be running out of time, start with modest, low-risk projects. Keep your objectives targeted. Define your measurements for success, etc., to experiment responsibly. So another aspect here is you do it in a controlled manner. So you can do use case discovery and a rapid viability assessment, like to say, okay, does GAI really make sense for this particular use case? Quick and dirty way to say, like, okay, this is going to work or not work. You can build out your GAI model. You then integrate it and implement the integration into all your processes and perform monitoring, etc. So if you're going to look for use cases, I think it's important to cast a very wide net initially, so that you make sure that the ones that you find that are really strong have been compared to a lot of other ones. So we have kind of a way of doing this, which is to look at the generative AI suitability here on the left, and then the business viability. And you'll know how to read these graphs, but basically you want to be on the upper right-hand side where you have use cases with strong business viability and GAI suitability. Here's are the things that we look at for suitability. Does it actually play to the strengths of an LLM, or are you better off using machine learning? Do you have the sandbox for it? What stack do you need? And also, is this a process that can tolerate errors, or is it easy to mitigate the errors? This is important because GIIs are not perfect all the time. So, and then business viability, I think most of you might know the aspects that go into that. Anything else, Josh? We have 4 minutes left.
A person's bringing up the question of security again, asking if they're using AI to win a customer within their industry, would their proprietary info then be accessible by a competitor? Are there firewalls for corporate data, and who and how is that defined? So the short answer to that question is you want to build a nice, safe sandbox for everyone to play in before you really deploy that to the real world. And Lucinda can touch on that in more detail here.
Yep. So here's a little drawing of the sandbox where you basically have your original generative AI model by whoever is the creator of that. You take that with all the factory settings, bring it into your corporate cloud or corporate data center, And then you basically are bring that in, but you do not let any data go out. And you can set it up where you can use your company data to fine tune the generative AI so that now this generative AI is based on the data that you have and can give you competitive advantage because your competitors and nobody else is going to get access to that, as opposed to using a public open generative AI, in which case there is a possibility that your data can be discovered, etc. Then here, once you run it through the generative AI, you get customized output based on your data that are for your specific use case and your business model. So this is one way how to do that. You need to also, people like Amazon Web Services, Azure, Data Robot can all provide this sort of structure and security. There are risks such as the hallucination, which is that generative AIs can give wrong answers and sound really confident about it. There can also be biased outputs as well. This is kind of, a BCG model of the simple to challenging costs of mitigation and the low risk and high risk to your business reputation. If you have wrong answers come out or very inappropriate things. So for copyright infringement, for example, with images, you can choose to use a different generative AI, such as Adobe Firefly, which only is trained on images that actually have gone out of copyright. I'm going to jump to the conclusions right now because we've got like 30 seconds left. But basically, pay attention. This is transforming business. Knowledge work is really impacted by a generative AI. And it can be, whether you want to use it or not, your competition and or malicious actors may use it against you. So it's important to know about it and learn about it. Move forward by responsibly experimenting, and we can help by educating clients like with webinars like this and help them realize the value that generative AI can unlock for your company in a responsible and safe manner. So any other questions, Josh?
Well, it does look like we're rolling up on 10:30 here. Someone was asking in the chat, what do I do when the model hallucinates? Maybe we can touch on that just very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. There's a lot that can be done with prompt engineering that really decreases the amount of hallucination. That also retrieval augmented generative AI, that way of doing 2 passes at the AI with detailed instructions is another way to do it. I don't think you eliminate it entirely right now. I'm sure that all the big players like Facebook, et cetera, understand the impact of hallucinations and that that those are important. It's probably being addressed as we're talking about this. But I think I wanted to point out here right now, generative AI is a great co-pilot, but it's not an autopilot. So I think that's important to understand that. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining. Want to keep our promise of keeping this thing a tight 30 minutes. I do just want to call out that if you had any questions that were not addressed, or you're just curious about generative AI and want to figure out, how to get your foot in the door, we are offering free 60-minute brainstorming sessions for some generative AI use cases. So please email ascentai@ironsidegroup.com and we can do a 60-minute session. Thanks so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.